Hey folks, Doug Blake with Body Design University. Welcome to another weekly study. And in this video, we're going to talk about from chapter 9, page 337, 338 in that area in the 6th edition about muscle spindle and Golgi tendon organ. Now, we could get very in depth into these two proprioceptors, or what are known as mechanoreceptors, but I really want to give you a little bit of insight and kind of help you to understand a little bit more about what those two mechanoreceptors do and the terms that are associated with them, okay? So again, as an intro, always say the same thing. There's two things you got to keep in mind as you're going through the ACE textbook, which is that you've got to pass their exam, right? That's why you're doing this. You're going to pass the exam and take a test. You're doing your practice exams, and ultimately you want to be able to say, hey, look, I passed my ACE exam. There's that part of it, and that's important. Remember, there's memorization that comes along with that. And then there's the other part of this, which is that once you pass it, what are you doing? What are you going to do? Well, hopefully you're going to be training clients. And for the most part, a lot of this information may not be relevant when you're actually in the real world and actually training people, maybe not. But there are certain concepts and certain things inside the textbook in this information that can really, really help you in the real world. And that's why we're going over this, because understanding the muscle spindle fibers and the Golgi tendon organ and their pertinence to training is really, really critical, because this has to deal with flexibility training and stretching and understanding some of the things that go along with that modality that you hopefully will be using. I mean, look, stretching is a very, very important part of the training process. Now, so I give you that kind of general overview, right? You really want to know certain things for the test. Obviously, we know that there are certain chapters that are more important than other chapters only in how they're represented on their testing. Okay, so you got to memorize that information. But then there's also the post-test, which really, to be honest with you, is very, very important. So I want you to understand muscle spindles and Golgi tendon. We do have students all the time, because there is a certain level of confusion that comes along with this, especially if you don't have anatomy phys background. And so that's what I wanted to do with you today in this video. I'm going to draw some things out. And by the way, my recommendation is have your textbook, again, 337, 338 is where the picture is. Do yourself a big favor. You know, the read, write, recite method is not just for writing down terms. You should. And you should know technically what a muscle spindle is from a purely academic perspective. You should be able to say a muscle spindle is a nerve muscle complex that sense is length of change in the muscle itself and causes the muscle belly to contract. Okay, that's what a muscle spindle does. What's a Golgi tendon organ? Well, a Golgi tendon organ is a neurological, neuromuscular, neurotendon, I guess if you want to say it, structure that tenses tension, right, on the muscle. So the load imposed on the muscle, and when it becomes stimulated, right, it inhibits the contraction of the muscle. In other words, it tells the muscle to relax. I mean, that's about as simple as it gets. Muscle spindles tell the muscle to contract or increase tension. Golgi tendon organs tell that muscle, the particular muscle that they are located in, to relax. And again, I'm always going to direct you to the textbook. Okay. Just keep in mind, whatever you want to do outside of studying the textbook and the ACE materials themselves, that's great, because there's a million YouTube videos out there that will talk directly to these particular mechanoreceptor structures. And if you want to go on those rabbit trails to learn more about them, absolutely, it's a great idea. However, from the testing perspective, stick with what's in the book. And I'm going to go over a couple of things to kind of help you to understand, or perhaps memorize it better, so that when you get a question on the test, you're not thrown off. And ACE will for sure ask you a question that relates to flexibility and stretching that speaks directly to these two particular structures. And the terms that they're going to use are what we call autogenic inhibition and reciprocal inhibition. Now, again, you don't want to get frustrated and confused by terms. Again, this is one of the really important tips we want to help you from a testing perspective is you've got to memorize terminology. Spend some time memorizing some of the terms. Don't jump into this chapter and continue to move on without memorizing terms. You should be able to rewrite, recite. You should be able to write down the definition. And by the way, that's one of the reasons why we have Quizlet study guides for every chapter in the ACE textbook. So there are, ways using gamification to memorize the material. So you should be able to write down autogenic inhibition. What is it? Well, write it down. You should memorize it. Conceptually, that's where I recommend, right? So you write it down, you memorize. That's where I recommend these guys. These are not highlighters. Don't highlight in the book, but draw the stuff out. It's really helpful. And by the way, we see students all the time posting in the Facebook group, posting their pictures and their drawings. And I see the replies and people are like, wow, can I get that? Well, sure. My recommendation is do it yourself. In fact, let me show you. I'm going to recommend, let me get an overhead for you. And by the way, I want you guys to get to this page, break out your book. Oh, by the way, if you have the digital right on the computer, my recommendation is print it out. You can look at it on your computer screen, right? But my recommendation is either have the textbook and look at it so you can draw it, or have the digital. And then I would print it out. So here I am on page 338. ACE I think they did a pretty good job of giving you a basic explanation and summary of what the Golgi tendon and muscle spindles are. And I'm not going to go too in depth, but I want to basically redraw for you. This is my recommendation. This tip is used throughout the entire textbook. Anytime you see these figures, drawings like this, I highly recommend you go ahead and redraw them yourself. It slows you down and gives you some time and opportunity to kind of consider and think about it. And if you are a visual learner, it will definitely help you. It helps everybody. It helps audiological, if you're talking about saying it out loud to yourself, visual, and then of course the rewriting of it is definitely going to be beneficial. The first part of this is to understand the muscle spindle fiber. Basically, I'm just going to do this for you and just redraw this. And in order to redraw it, do it and speak it out while you're doing it. Okay. So the muscle spindle fiber, remember what I said, it tells the muscle to contract or to build up tension. And the muscle spindle fiber is located, I'm just going to draw the muscle like this. The muscle spindle fiber is located generally deep within the muscle in what are known as intrafusal fibers. Okay, you see definitions. Extrafusal are the contractile fibers of a muscle. Intrafusal fibers are the guys that kind of go along for the ride. As the extrafusal fibers generate tension and shorten and lengthen, the intrafusal fibers are basically detection mechanisms. They're just detecting the movement of the muscle. As the muscle lengthens and the muscle shortens, the muscle spindle fibers, as you can see in the drawing, right? Those muscle spindle fibers are sending neurological impulses to the spinal column. So then I would just draw them. Now, I wouldn't draw it unless you want to get real in depth. I just draw a circle to show the spinal cord, right? Spinal cord this way, right? And then it's just a cross section. Draw the spinal cord. These guys, these muscle spindle fibers are sending neurological impulses to the spinal cord, right? And that's all this is depicting over here, right? So this sensory, what we call a sensory neuron, it's sending information, neurological information to the spinal cord. The spinal cord is then going to send an impulse back to the muscle itself, to the extrafusal fibers, the contractile fibers, and it's going to tell the muscle to build tension or contract. And that's how it works. Okay. So this is the way the muscle spindle works. Now I'm going to move on and I'm going to give you a little bit more explanation of how this now corresponds to the term reciprocal inhibition and autogenic inhibition, but I wanted to get to the next mechanoreceptor that works with the muscle spindle fibers. And keep in mind, generally, when we talk about flexibility and all this other stuff, these guys work together. These two guys work together. The GTO, or the Golgi tendon organ, is on this picture. That's why they did I think figure 912 is actually really, really well done, because it puts the two of them together and it shows you how they function, or how they actually can function together. And in their explanation, ACE gives you a pretty good, they do a pretty good job of explaining that to you. So Golgi tendon organ, same muscle. The difference here is that the muscle spindle fibers are located in the muscle. They are actual fibers of the muscle, whereas the Golgi tendon organ is located in the tendinous or musculotendinous area of the muscle itself, right? So muscle spindles are in the muscle, Golgi tendon, right? Hence the term Golgi tendon organ are located within the tendon. You know, tendons for the most part are made up of collagen, right? And those collagen are long fibers, and these guys are basically attached to them, so to speak. And when these guys get stimulated, see spinal cord? I'm going to draw another spinal cord. When these guys get stimulated, they go to the spinal cord. And as you can see on this drawing right here, again, this is why I would be drawing this out. It's going to help you to memorize it. That information from the tendon goes to the spinal column, okay, and sends back an impulse to do what? To relax the muscle. Now, how does it do that? Well, what is contracting the muscle? What's keeping the muscle tense all the time? Muscle spindle fibers. It's what we call tonus. Tonus is simply a term that describes the low-grade constant contraction of a muscle due to muscle spindle fiber activation. It's always kind of working and keeping the muscle, you know, supple and kind of firm. The GTO, when it gets stimulated, it actually tells the muscle to downgrade or, quote, inhibit. That's where that term, see, inhibitory neuron. Okay, so it inhibits the muscle spindle fibers. And that's how, basically, for the most part, that's how this works. So this inhibitory neuron basically tells the muscle, right? Tells the muscle to relax, right? So ultimately what you get is, you know, a dance. Think about it as a dance. Muscle spindles contract, Golgi tendons relax, right? And they work simultaneously with each other in the same muscle, right? So they work with each other in the same muscle to affect tension development, relaxation, and movement, right? So that's how they work. Muscle spindles tell the muscle to contract. Golgi tendons tell the muscle to relax. All well and good. But now we get to this concept of what's known as autogenic inhibition and reciprocal inhibition. Essentially what happens is that, and by the way, the muscle spindle fiber creates what's known as the stretch reflex. That is where we see, so muscle spindle fibers is where we talk about or understand the concept of reciprocal inhibition. Okay, so understanding reciprocal inhibition relates to the muscle spindle fibers, whereas the Golgi tendon organ in general, this is where we talk about what's known as autogenic inhibition. Okay, so reciprocal inhibition, autogenic inhibition, that's an N. Okay, and that's an H. Okay, this is where the two of them come in. Now, when you look at this picture here of muscle spindle fibers, and you look at the Golgi tendon organ, those are incomplete. And that's why it's a good picture, but it doesn't really give you the complete picture. This picture actually, because this is just explaining the muscle spindle fiber. Reciprocal inhibition involves the antagonistic muscle. Now, I know students get confused because the terms agonist and antagonist kind of throw you off. That's the bone. Let's just say that's your upper arm bone, and that's your bicep. And this is your tricep. When we talk about reciprocal inhibition, we're talking about how the muscle spindle fibers in the agonist, this is the guy that's actually working, the agonist. This is where this guy, through the muscle spindle fiber activation, actually has a inhibitory response on the antagonistic. This is one of the reasons why I recommend you draw this. It slows you down and it gets you thinking, okay? The muscle spindle fiber that is active in the agonist, right? Not only does it send an impulse to tell the muscle itself to contract, right? So it's going to tell this guy to contract. Actually, what it also does in reciprocal inhibition is inhibits the antagonist. So in order for the bicep to contract and go through a normal movement pattern of contraction, it's essentially telling the tricep to what? Relax. Okay, so there's an inhibitory component to this. Well, what inhibits the muscle spindle, or what inhibits a muscle, right? It's the Golgi tendon organ. So we have this interesting dance between the agonist's muscle spindle fibers and the antagonist's Golgi tendon organs. And they're constantly relaying and sending information back and forth to ensure that when this guy contracts, this guy relaxes. That's called reciprocal inhibition. And of course, it has profound effects on flexibility and stretching, which is why when you read through this, take your time reading through this, because this has all the information you need. It's real world stuff. It's why, for instance, and they speak about proprioceptive neuromuscular facility, PNF stretching. That's generally the way I've always stretched my clients, is using a PNF modality or modified PNF modality. Okay. The point is that it has profound effects when you understand this on your flexibility and stretching. The GTO talks about autogenic inhibition. Well, in autogenic inhibition, we're dealing with basically one muscle. And that's what this picture right here is showing you. Okay, so what the GTO does is it inhibits the muscle that it is connected to. Okay, so the tendons, right? So the GTOs are located in the musculotendinous organ. Autogenic inhibition is the picture that I drew originally, where the stimulation of the excitation of the Golgi tendon organ causes a reflexive arc that then inhibits the muscle and it relaxes. We call this autogenic inhibition. Now, what they don't show you in this picture is another part of the GTO. Autogenic inhibition is technically a dual interneuron-based excitation system. We have inhibition here, but we also have excitation of the antagonist here. So yes, even though they're not going to tell you in autogenic inhibition, but technically autogenic inhibition not only relaxes the muscle, and that's why we normally say it's a single muscle. Autogenic inhibition involves only the muscle it's working. And technically, and I'm only giving you this as an aside, technically autogenic inhibition, or and this reflexive arc system right here is sort of the anti-reflexive arc situation. What happens is autogenic inhibition also has a stimulatory effect on the antagonistic muscle. It's just important to kind of understand that when we're looking at these two concepts, you're trying to understand what's going to help you ultimately from a flexibility and stretching perspective. So muscle spindle fibers do what? Tell the muscle to contract. We call that the stretch reflex, myotatic reflex. I mean, there's a number of terms that are used for both of these, depends on who you're reading. Reciprocal inhibition basically speaks to how the muscle spindle fibers, when it's stimulated, does basically two things. Okay, remember, reciprocal inhibition does basically two things because of the muscle spindles working in the agonist or agonistic muscle. Okay, you see, if you say it slow and you draw it out, it could be helpful, probably more helpful. Okay, so muscle spindle fibers tell the muscle that they're located in to contract. Simultaneously, through what's known as reciprocal inhibition, not only is it telling the, in this case, say the bicep, to contract, but at the same time, the muscle spindle stimulation tells the Golgi tendon or activates the Golgi tendon organs in the antagonistic muscle, the tricep, and therefore the tricep relaxes. Okay, so we have reciprocal inhibition basically has a stimulatory effect on the agonist and a inhibitory effect on the antagonist. Autogenic inhibition is initiated by the Golgi tendon. So it's just one of the easiest ways to think about this. Reciprocal inhibition is initiated by the muscle spindle. Autogenic inhibition is initiated by the Golgi tendon. But to separate those two as two totally different things that are occurring does not speak to the reality of what's happening between agonist and antagonistic pairs. Remember, it's a dance. Muscle spindles, Golgi tendons, agonist and antagonist are all working together, right, to create smooth, controlled movement, efficient movement in the musculoskeletal system. Autogenic inhibition is initiated by the GTO, and what does it do? It causes a reflex arc to inhibit or deactivate the muscle to reduce tension. Crazy enough, there is another part of that which actually tells the antagonistic muscle to tense. So you can see this balance. Muscle spindle, Golgi tendon, these guys are working together. Hope that is not more confusing. What I want you to do when you're going through this chapter in particular, and when you're going through the other chapters, is anytime you see these pictures, do yourself a big favor. Draw them out, take your time, slow down a little bit. And if you have any questions, you can always just post them in a Facebook group or leave the comments below. Hope this was helpful. The idea is that once you get to areas like this, truly understand them, try to appreciate not just the memorization, which is critical, but try to fully appreciate where their relevance is in the actual training scenario that you're going to have with clients. And by the way, I would imagine most of you already training yourself, do this on yourself. It can actually be beneficial. So again, muscle spindle fibers, Golgi tendon organs, autogenic inhibition, reciprocal inhibition, really important for the exam, but even more important for the real world once you start training people. Remember to go ahead and subscribe to our YouTube channel, hit the bell so that you get the notifications when all the content comes out. And as always, have a great weekend. It's a pleasure to give you this information. Let us know how we can be of assistance. Thanks. Take care.